forgot to write the cute little joke.
Books. Books. Books.
Hello, and welcome to Didn't Read It, the podcast that doesn't have a funny intro this time. I am your host, Grace Todd, a writer, editor, and gardener who has not yet gone mad with power, but give it time. With me today is friend of the pod, Galen Canham. Galen, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I am Galen. I am a bartender here in Richmond. I am a longtime friend and housemate of Grace's, occasional gardening buddy, and a future coal cult leader.
One of these days, we're going to pull it off. I mean, you need a good bartender for a cult. It's absolutely vital.
It's one of the ways you lure people in.
Yeah, that and spooky plants.
We're good at both of those.
Exactly. So as you already said, you and I are both avid gardeners. We even did some landscaping together back in the day. And the other thing I know about you is that you're pretty into the literature of the weird, your sci-fis, your horrors. Is that right?
Yes, very correct.
Well, today I've brought you a book that, shall we say, hybridizes those two interests.
Perfect.
I mean, well, I say book. I shouldn't say book. It's a short story by Nathaniel Hawthorne called Rappaccini's Daughter. And it's all about spooky gardens and the horrors of the patriarchy.
Two of our favorite things.
Two of our absolute favorite things. This short story came to me in a collection published by the British Library and edited by the impeccably named Daisy Butcher. Like, I'm not sure what's the term for nominal determinism? I'm not sure I 100% buy into nominal determinism, but then you see a person named Daisy Butcher editing a collection called Evil Roots, Killer Tales of the Botanical Gothic, and you're like, well, Daisy.
It's too fitting.
This is the role you were born to play. Galen, what, if anything, do you know about Nathaniel Hawthorne and the works of Nathaniel Hawthorne?
I know extremely little about Nathaniel Hawthorne and the works of Nathaniel Hawthorne. I am aware of The Scarlet Letter and have read excerpts from it, and I know that some very cheesy movies have been made based off of it. Unless there's some other famous works of his that I am not connecting as being his, that's pretty much the extent of it.
Yeah, I think The Scarlet Letter, and then there's another one called Young Goodman Brown, and those are kind of the big two that they assign in high school a lot.
I've heard of the second one, but know even less about it.
He's a fellow New Englander.
My people.
Yeah. He's one of yours. Broadly, like, pretty into themes of hypocrisy and rightness and morality run amok. And then, what, if anything, do you know about the Gothic tradition? What are your touch points for Gothic literature?
I know far more about Gothic architecture than I do about Gothic literature, unfortunately. I really don't have a lot of experience in it, so this will be a fun educational opportunity for me.
Or fortunately, because Gothic architecture is dope.
Oh, Gothic architecture is dope.
Yeah.
Big fan.
It's great. It's very pointy, I feel like.
Know a lot about Gothic fashion, about Gothic music.
What's Gothic fashion?
Well, I mean, just, goth kids, that kind of fashion.
Oh,
not
right.
not of the era of the genre.
Just like, do they try and replicate like the pointy arches in the clothing, or?
I mean, honestly, some of it does. I don't know if that's intentional or just looks extra spooky.
I routinely forget that goth is just an abbreviation of Gothic.
It is.
Look, we can't all know things about words. All right. So now that we know that you know nothing about Nathaniel Hawthorne, which is fine, let me tell you the story of Rappaccini's Daughter. Our protagonist, Giovanni, is a young student who's moved to Padua to pursue his studies. And we don't ever find out what he's studying, although I saw a lot of texts that were just like, he's a medical student, but that's not really outlined, mostly because he shows up and immediately starts doing anything but the stuff he's there to do. In true student moving to a new town fashion.
Yeah, that'll happen.
Yeah. Not that you would know anything about that.
Not at all.
So Giovanni gets to Padua and he's a little homesick for the sunshine of Naples. He's also a little bit of a tit, although that becomes more obvious later. He moves into his rented room and seeing that he's feeling homesick, his new landlady is like, well, look, you have a beautiful view of this garden. Look at the garden. It'll cheer you up. And he's like, oh, is that part of the house? And she's like, oh, no. That belongs to Dr. Rappaccini next door. And it's a walled garden. It's very beautiful, but also almost immediately kind of ominous in the way that these things are. And he sits gazing out the window, and it doesn't take long before he sees Dr. Rappaccini himself, who has a face singularly marked with intellect and cultivation, but which could never, even in his more youthful days, have expressed much warmth of heart.
Ooh.
All right. Spooky doctor next door. And so Giovanni sits and watches Dr. Rappaccini putzing around in the garden in the way that old men do, but he immediately notices that the doctor is treating the plants around him as if they are very dangerous. So he says, there was no approach of intimacy between himself and these vegetable existences, which is a delightful way to phrase that.
It really is.
The man's demeanor was that of one walking among malignant influences, such as savage beasts or deadly snakes, which, should he allow them one moment of license, would wreak upon him some terrible fatality. It was strangely frightful to see this air of insecurity in a person cultivating a garden, which had been alike the joy and labor of the unfallen parents of the race. Was this garden then the Eden of the present world? And this man, with such a perception of harm in what his own hands caused to grow, was he the Adam?
Ooh.
Right? Right off the bat, we establish this garden is weird. Dr. Rappaccini's kind of terrifying looking. And Giovanni clearly has a very fertile imagination.
Yes, very much so. Love that for him.
You know, he's a young student, he's out in the world, and he is indulging in flights of fancy.
And spying on his neighbors.
And
a time-honored tradition.
God, I know, I haven't thought about that in a long time, but I feel like that is a thing you do when you're a very young person living alone for the first time. You're like, oh, I can just be a weirdo.
Yeah. Not that I've ever done that before, but...
Well, so the next thing Giovanni does is he indulges in another time-honored tradition of young people, which is he sees a beautiful woman out of his window and completely loses his mind over it. Because Dr. Rappaccini, he puts on like a mask to approach one plant in the middle of the garden that's growing in an old fountain. And it's described as being this like beautiful, almost ethereal, tropical plant with big purple flowers. And the doctor goes to do something to it, puts the mask on, and then seems to decide that even that is too much of a risk. And he calls for his daughter. Beatrice comes running out of the house, and he tells her that he is too old now, I guess, and can no longer take care of this particular plant, and that it's now her responsibility, which she is totally fine with. She says, and gladly I will undertake it. And then she embraces the plant, just like wraps her arms around it, and says, yes, my sister, my splendor, it shall be Beatrice's task to nurse and serve thee. And thou shalt reward her with thy kisses and perfume breath, which to her is as the breath of life.
This is just reading to me as parents foisting their burdens onto their children.
Oh, just you wait. So Giovanni is watching all of this, and he's immediately like, he doubts whether it were a girl tending her favorite flower or one sister performing the duties of affection to another. So Giovanni is like, this girl is beautiful, but also a little spooky. He watches this whole scene play out, kind of debating with himself whether the garden is kind of freaking him out or if he's into it. Yeah. And he hasn't decided yet. And there's a point where he's like, basically goes to bed. He wakes up the next morning. The garden is bathed in sunlight, and he decides to take a most rational view of the matter. He's like, there's nothing weird about this garden or these people. It's totally fine. It's whatever. He goes to visit the only person he knows in Padua, who is Signor Pietro Baglioni, who is a professor of medicine at the university and an old friend of his father's. They sit down to dinner, they have some wine, and Giovanni, because he knows that Professor Baglioni is a famous medical professor, he knows Dr. Rappaccini is a famous medical professor, so he, in a very young person way, is like, hey, you probably know my new neighbor, Dr. Rappaccini. And Baglioni's like, that fucking dude, in as many words. Baglioni does this really shady thing, and it's one of those... The story is written from Giovanni's perspective, and so you have to really read between the lines with a lot of this stuff. But Baglioni's not as good a dude as he comes across as at first. He launches into a little bit of a diatribe about Rappaccini, where he acknowledges that Rappaccini's methods work, but then at the same time is basically like he's a quack. And more importantly, he's so obsessed with science and medicine that he doesn't actually care about people.
Yeah.
Like, he has no heart, is Baglioni's assessment of the situation. And it says, he cares infinitely more for science than for mankind. His patients are interesting to him only as subjects for some new experiment. He would sacrifice human life, his own among the rest, or whatever else was dearest to him, for the sake of adding so much as a grain of mustard seed to the great heap of his accumulated knowledge. Which is like an oldie-timey medical professor's way of being like, fuck that dude.
Yeah, clearly no love lost here.
No. And Giovanni kind of tries to be like, well, but he's effective. Doesn't that matter? And Baglioni's basically like, no, it doesn't matter. And then Giovanni sort of comes back with, well, there must be one thing he cares about, right? His daughter. And Baglioni's response is weird. He says, so you've heard of this daughter, who all the young men in Padua are wild about, though not half a dozen have ever seen her face. I know little of the Signora Beatrice, save that Rappaccini is said to have instructed her deeply in his science, and that, young and beautiful as fame reports her, she is already qualified to fill a professor's chair. Perchance her father destines her for mine, which is odd.
Yeah.
That's a weird... He doesn't care about his daughter at all, but also her father has instructed her sort of unnaturally, is kind of the implication here.
Is that implication coming from some weird nefarious thing, or just like, she's a lady, why does he think she can be practicing medicine?
Little column A, little column B, also just put a pin in that for where it's going to go. Because everything having to do with Beatrice and how much Beatrice knows and how much her father has educated her is a big and really interesting question at the heart of this story. And one of the questions that I still have about this passage and this scene is it true? Or is this some, like, weird rumor that's gotten started because Beatrice has been kept away in this walled garden for her entire life?
Yeah, I mean, people are going to wildly speculate about what that means.
Right.
Regardless of the reasoning for it.
So the big thing that we learn is that Baglioni and Rappaccini, we the reader know this. Giovanni sort of knows this, but doesn't seem to pick up on it. And Baglioni doesn't overtly admit it. But Baglioni and Rappaccini are rivals. Bitter, long-time rivals.
Okay.
Who come from different schools of medicine. And what Baglioni accuses Rappaccini of is being convinced that human maladies can be cured by the poisons of plants. Which is funny because...
He's not wrong.
He is correct.
Yeah.
So Giovanni goes home, and what we get next is basically a series of scenes of him being kind of a creep, and watching Beatrice through the window while she putters in the garden.
Sorry, Giovanni being a creep.
Sorry, yes. Cool. Giovanni.
Just making sure.
So Giovanni and Baglioni have dinner. Baglioni fills him in on all the hot goss about the Rappaccini family and then sends him home. Giovanni proceeds to, again, do no actual studying at any point in this story. So he starts just mooning around, watching Beatrice through the window, and... My favorite part is that Hawthorne explicitly underlines that Giovanni is basically lying around creating fairy tales and narratives in his own head. He's convincing himself about all of these things about Beatrice and hasn't even really met her yet.
And will continue on generations of young men imparting a personality on a beautiful face that they know nothing about.
Indeed. And also ignoring things about them that are kind of important.
Yep.
He watches her kill an insect by breathing on it.
Oh, that's not good.
By accident. She clearly feels bad, but like a butterfly flies past her face and she breathes on it and it dies.
Oh no.
And he watches her pick a flower from that shrub in the middle of the garden, and a drop of sap comes out of the flower and happens to land on the little lizard that's scuttling by, and the lizard dies immediately.
Okay.
And she pins the flower to her dress.
Throwing up some red flags here.
what's wild is that his response at first is to say, "Am I awake? Have I my senses? What is this being? Beautiful, shall I call her? Or inexpressly terrible?" And like, go ahead.
No, I don't know what I was going to say.
I feel like it's a thing we've been watching young men do forever, is like, man, this woman is such a bad idea. And also, she's so hot.
She's so crazy. I want to hang out with her.
And I'm allowed to say this because I was that girl.
Oh, same. 100%. I've also done that to dudes before. Like, that guy's messed up. Let's see what's going to happen here.
I feel like a plot hole that people love to point out is something like this, where it's, oh man, this person is literally poisonous. I want to make the sex with them. And people are always like, that's so irrational. And I'm like, that's just what people do.
Horniness is not rational.
No.
Sadly. Would that it were, but
If only.
would have saved us both a lot of trouble in our early 20s.
The world would be a very different place for all of us, I think. So yeah, I mean, I guess for the rest of the story, you got to get yourself in the Giovanni headset, which is, you're horny, you're irrational, you're clearly like kind of a romantic, and you are prone to spinning flights of fancy about things.
Yeah, and then all of that would be compounded by boredom and loneliness.
Correct. Yeah. So Beatrice and Giovanni finally communicate with each other through the window. She's out in the garden. He's spying on her like a creep. He sees her murder an insect with her breath again. He leans forward because he's startled by it, and she sees him, and they start talking to each other. He throws her some flowers that he happened to have in his room. They have a cute little conversation, and then she goes inside. As she's leaving, he thinks that he can see that the flowers have already wilted in her hand. It's good. It's good, and it's healthy. This is,
Yep.
Yeah. These are all great plans. He does the thing that every man in his 20s has done since the dawn of time. And for about 2 seconds is like, man, I don't know what's going on with this garden next door, but I should probably opt out of this narrative. And then he does not do that at all.
Shocking turn of events.
And instead, he just winds up lying around spinning these kind of increasingly elaborate fantasies about Beatrice and how amazing and special she must be. And Hawthorne, in what passes for biting satire in 1844, well, not satire, I guess, but Hawthorne notes that Giovanni had not a deep heart, or at all events, its depths were not sounded now. But he had a quick fancy and an ardent southern temperament, which rose every instant to a high fever pitch. Beatrice had instilled a fierce and subtle poison into his system. It was not love, although her rich beauty was a madness to him, nor horror, even while he fancied her spirit to be imbued with the same baneful essence which seemed to pervade her physical frame, but a wild offspring of both love and horror that had each parent in it, and burned like one and shivered like the other.
That's a good description of many men in their 20s.
And a great description of being infatuated with someone that you absolutely should not keep hanging out with.
Yeah.
This passage concludes with, "Blessed are all simple emotions, be they dark or bright. It is the lurid intermixture of the two that produces the illuminating blaze of the infernal regions."
That's amazing.
Ay. He's all in.
He's deeply smitten.
He's obsessed.
Yeah.
In true Gothic fashion, he starts to get kind of weird and almost feverish. He's obsessing over Beatrice all day. He runs into Baglioni in the street and doesn't even seem to recognize him. Baglioni stops him and is like, what the hell is going on? Even though he clearly already knows. And Giovanni tells him basically to off.
Yeah.
And it's noted that Giovanni is in that state of all young people where he knows Baglioni won't approve of his infatuation and therefore just doesn't want to talk to him at all. Which again, relatable.
Yeah.
But the last thing that Baglioni says as they're speaking is that he is convinced that Giovanni is a subject of one of Rappaccini's experiments.
I mean, everything I've heard so far, that wouldn't be beyond the pale.
Right?
I'm already going to venture a guess we're, maybe halfway through the story that things are not going to end well for Giovanni.
We'll see. We'll see how things go for old Gigi. Immediately after he runs into Baglioni, in part because this is a short story, but also in part because this is not the most subtle story in the entire world. His landlady comes out of nowhere and is like, hey, you want to get in the garden? And Giovanni is obviously ecstatic.
Hell yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, and she basically asks for a bribe. In my personal opinion, Rappaccini put her up to it. It doesn't say that overtly, but that is my theory. He finally gets into the garden, just wanders right in, and is standing there by himself. Beatrice comes out and thankfully doesn't freak out to see a random dude in the garden.
Yeah.
They take a nice little walk together, and he, encountering her for the first time, closer than a window away, is like, oh, she's just like a person. She's just like a nice lady. When he finds out he can go into the garden, it says, the instant he was aware of the possibility of approaching Beatrice, it seemed an absolute necessity of his existence to do so. It mattered not whether she were angel or demon. He was irrevocably within her sphere.
Did this just not occur to him before?
It seems not to have, no.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just curious.
Yep. So he gets in, he's wandering around. Beatrice isn't there yet. And the first thing he notices is that the plants up close are even creepier than he realized from the window. And specifically, it says that there are, like, a bunch of them appear to be weird hybrids of other kinds of plants. None of it is recognizable, or most of it isn't cleanly recognizable as any kind of plant he's seen before. You know, we're getting into kind of some of that early sci-fi kind of stuff. Beatrice appears and is shockingly not terrified that there's a random dude in the garden. Mm-hmm. And they start to talk. And it says that she is so unworldly that he starts speaking to her like she's a child. The listeners can't hear the face you're making.
I know. Sorry, I just realized that. I don't like that.
It's not great. Yeah, what is it? Her questions indicated such seclusion and such lack of familiarity with modes and forms that Giovanni responded as if to an infant. Hot.
Yeah. I don't even like talking to children like they're children.
Yeah, well, Giovanni's apparently into sexy babies.
Ugh.
Yeah.
Ugh.
But then it also says, essentially, that it turns out, is just like a nice person. She just asks him lots of questions about himself.
So she's a good conversationalist.
Uh-huh. Which he loves. Shocking. So they're having a nice little walk and flirt, and they make their way to the center of the garden where the spooky purple shrub is, and he reaches out to touch it like a moron.
After he saw the whole sap killing lizard situation.
Uh-huh. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. And she screams, physically grabs him to pull him back, and then their little interview concludes. He takes none of this to heart. He notices absolutely nothing. He leaves, thoroughly confused by all of the things, but also thrilled at having been touched by her. He wakes up the next morning with a perfect purple handprint on his hand that burns.
I'm assuming exactly where she grabbed his hand to stop him from touching the poison plant.
That is correct.
Yep.
And it's hand-shaped. And he's like, it must be a bug bite.
Oh my god. Oh, you poor baby.
Yep. And so they tumble into love. He goes to see her every single day. It's all he can ever think about. Except that they don't touch each other. They say, by all appreciable signs they loved. They had looked love with eyes that conveyed the holy secret from the depths of one soul into the other. Yet there had been no seal of lips, no clasp of hands, nor any slightest caress, such as love claims and hallows. And on the couple of occasions that Giovanni kind of tries to be like, hey, baby, you want to go?
Let's go make out in the corner over there.
Yeah, it says she grew so sad, so stern, and withal wore such a look of desolate separation, shuddering at itself, that not a spoken word was requisite to repel him. But it's also noted that at such times he was startled at the horrible suspicions that arose, monster-like, out of the caverns of his heart, and stared him in the face. His love grew thin and faint as the morning mist. His doubts alone have substance. So basically, like, he thinks he's in love with her, but Hawthorne is also kind of going out of his way to be like, this kid's kind of a tit.
Yeah.
He's not the brightest.
Yeah.
But they're smitten, and they're spending all their time together. Which is when Baglioni kind of makes his final salvo, shall we say, in the Doctor Wars. Baglioni shows up at Giovanni's apartment and tells him the original myth of the poison woman, which is this courtesan who was sent to Alexander the Great, who it turned out had been, like, infused with poison, such that if he had made love to her, he would have died.
Okay.
And Baglioni's like, that's sure an interesting story, huh?
Is this sounding familiar to you at all?
You know, it's just thinking about it for no reason. Story of the poison woman. And Giovanni throws a temper tantrum, of course. But before Baglioni leaves, he's like, I have this antidote that I had made up for you. It will reverse any poison at all. And maybe it's not too late for your Beatrice to be saved. Maybe she isn't a monster. Maybe we can bring her back into sort of the land of normalcy.
And honestly, good looking out on Baglioni, this guy who keeps telling him to fuck off, basically.
Yeah, it's Baglioni is like an old friend of Giovanni's dad's, apparently, and so he's
like, I gotta look out for this dumbass.
Yeah. I mean, and that's definitely how Giovanni seems to view it, even though he's irritated. Mm-hmm. Baglioni says, it is not yet too late for the rescue. Possibly we may even succeed in bringing back this miserable child within the limits of ordinary nature, from which her father's madness has estranged her. Giovanni's not buying it, at least not in the moment. And so Baglioni leaves, and then there's this weird aside where Baglioni has a little villain moment on the stairs by himself, where he, like, leaves the apartment and he's in the stairwell and he's like, we'll thwart Rappaccini yet. And then he trots off. It's
fully has me imagining Mr. Burns right now.
Yeah, essentially. Who is, like, Mr. Burns' nemesis, though? Because I feel like, as described, Rappaccini is more of, like, a Mr. Burns. And I'm envisioning Baglioni as, maybe just because the word bag is in his name, I'm envisioning him as, like, a little more floppy.
That's fair. I mean, he didn't really have a true nemesis, although the Simpsons family frequently accidentally came up against him.
That is true.
Through pure happenstance.
It's, Baglioni is Smithers, but during one of the periods where they're, like, mad at each other.
Mm-hmm. Yep, when they're in the midst of a lover spat.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
New headcanon, Baglioni and Rappaccini are lovers who just get mad every few years and develop a feud and then get back together. So Baglioni has his supervillain moment. Giovanni's not buying it, but then he goes to buy flowers for Beatrice and essentially watches them wilt in his own hand.
Oh no.
Uh-huh. And he's alone in his room and he's like, oh, that's a bad sign. And he walks over to a spider in a spider web and breathes on it and watches it die in real time.
Ooh.
It's not great. And he's like, oh shit, I'm poisoned too.
And so far, they've only touched that one time where he got the giant purple, quote, bug bite.
Yes.
Okay.
But they've been spending all day, every day together in the garden.
Yeah.
And somehow it's like osmosis through him in ways that Hawthorne doesn't take the time to explain.
And he's been in the garden with her too, not just with her, but with her
in the
spooky garden.
She never leaves the garden.
Yeah.
The garden is the only place she ever goes.
And we haven't heard anything else or seen Rappaccini in amongst this, right? There's no mention of him, like...
No, he's just lurking.
Yeah.
I think like Giovanni sees him like once, you know, like Beatrice goes inside and Rappaccini's standing there like, but like Rappaccini's barely on the page at all.
Okay.
So Giovanni realizes that Beatrice, his beloved Beatrice, has made him poisonous.
Dun dun dun.
And he reacts. Guess how he reacts. Guess what his first response is.
I'm assuming it has to do with him going to Beatrice and, like, I don't know, trying to make out with her.
Misogynistic rage. That's correct. Oh. Misogynistic rage. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah, that's not as surprising.
Yeah. So he storms into the garden to attack her. Not quite physically, but he basically starts screaming at her for making him toxic, for alienating him from the rest of humankind. And she's heartbroken, genuinely heartbroken. And she's like, I had no idea. And she basically kind of manages to get out that, you know, she knew she was poisonous. She never imagined that she would have any effect on him, and that she knew that their romance was always going to be doomed, but that she thought she could love him for a little while and that eventually she'd have to let him go.
Yeah.
And he has broken her heart in this moment. He has shattered her because she genuinely loved him. It turns out when push came to shove,
he did not genuinely love her.
He was inadequate. And so she kind of collapses, but she's getting herself back together. And her father comes out and explains that he turned Giovanni poisonous in... The mechanics are not important here. In order to be a husband for Beatrice.
Oh.
It's a little, bride of... This
is Frankenstein asking for a partner. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's Giovanni is the bride of Frankenstein. Or the bride of Frankenstein's monster, I should say. And so the three of them are in the garden. Giovanni is losing his shit at Rappaccini for having made him poisonous. Beatrice is demanding to know why her father would have done this. And her father lashes out at her in a really interesting way. And there's this brief little juncture where Hawthorne points out that they've been severed from humanity, the two of them. Mm-hmm. But instead of this bringing them together, Giovanni is using it to drive them apart. Which isn't to say that he's not somewhat justifiably upset at having been turned into a walking poison.
Yeah, I'd be mad, but also, like, you can look on the bright side here and be like, oh, I can touch her now. There's a silver lining here.
And also, it's not Beatrice's fault.
It's not.
So the three of them are standing in the garden, and Beatrice finally asks her father why he did this to her. And he says, "Do you deem it misery to be endowed with marvelous gifts against which no power nor strength could avail an enemy? Misery to be able to quell the mightiest with a breath? Misery to be as terrible as thou art beautiful? Wouldst thou then have preferred the condition of a weak woman, exposed to all evil and capable of none?"
I'm not saying I don't get where he's coming from.
It's interesting, right? But in the midst of all of this, Giovanni is like, look, it's not too late. I have this antidote that Baglioni gave me. You drink it and then I'll drink it and we'll be fine. Mm-hmm. And Beatrice goes, I'll drink it. And she says, do await the result.
Yeah, probably a smart call.
Well, so she means like, I'll drink it. Hang on. Like, don't go anywhere.
Yeah.
Because the antidote, she drinks it. Her father comes out. They're all yelling at each other. Her father delivers that line about, would you have preferred to be a weak woman, exposed to all evil and capable of none? And she says, I would fain have been loved, not feared. And then she dies.
Yeah. I mean, not a surprising turn of events there.
No. Yeah. So she dies. And her last words are, farewell, Giovanni. Thy words of hatred are like lead within my heart, but they too will fall away as I ascend. Oh, was there not, from the first, more poison in thy nature than in mine?
Some good last words.
Yeah. And then as her father and Giovanni are looking at her dead body, Baglioni pops like out of a window and yells, Rappaccini! And is this the upshot of your experiment? And that's the end of the story.
Oh my God. I'm going to murder your daughter to prove a point as to why the science you're doing is bad.
Uh-huh.
Which, like...
overtly.
Yeah. Like, that's straight up just what he did.
Yep. So that's Rappaccini's daughter. That's the whole story.
It's very frustrating.
It is very frustrating on the behalf of Beatrice.
Yeah, very much so. She's the only one I'm not frustrated with in that entire story.
Hashtag justice for Beatrice. So what do you think? What are your thoughts?
I enjoyed your retelling of it. I'm curious to read the whole thing. Some interesting words.
Words are words.
It's fascinating perspective on like women's lack of agency and what that means for them. I get what Rappaccini was saying about like, wouldn't you rather be strong and be able to like, but you didn't give her a choice and you did it in the worst possible way.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
Like, I'm going to give you all this power and make you confined to this tiny walled garden and to kill anything. It's strongly giving me Rogue from X-Men vibes.
I was going to say, I feel like that exact scene has been in like 4 different superhero movies.
Yes, that was like immediately what came to mind with that.
Nathaniel Hawthorne, early contributor to the MCU.
Wouldn't that be the DC universe? Anyways, not sure.
I think it is. I think X-Men specifically is the DCU. I just like making fun of Marvel whenever I can. Really.
Very fair.
I feel like that's kind of isn't that part of Black Widow's narrative too? Where they're like, we made you into an unstoppable killing machine. And she's like, I wish you hadn't.
Yeah, it is. It's definitely, and it's always women.
It's always women.
Yeah.
Every time. I, for one, would not like to be turned into a weapon without my consent. But that's just me and my dumb lady brains, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so one of the things I find really compelling about this narrative is some of the historical context for it, which is Hawthorne's wife was named Sophia Peabody before she married him when she became Sophia Hawthorne. And Sophia Abel, she sounds really interesting, and I kind of want to go read a biography of her at some point. She seems to have had like her own frustrated artistic impulses that she never really got to explore properly as a result of being Nathaniel Hawthorne's wife.
Yeah.
But she certainly seemed to love Hawthorne, and they seemed to have a pretty good marriage overall. But Sophia had migraines for her entire adult life, which the whole family seemed to believe stemmed from treatments that her father gave her when she was teething as a small child. Because her father was a doctor, and he apparently dosed her with like mercury and a lot of narcotics.
Oh no.
When she was teething.
Oh, poor baby.
Which was fashionable at the time, and clearly exactly what a growing baby needs.
Yeah, I mean, I've looked at some old-timey medicine bottle labels. That's unsurprising, but
also
can't have worked.
Not great.
No.
And whether or not it's the case, she certainly believed that that was what started her lifelong issue with migraines.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you just get migraines too. I know a lot of people that deal with that, but having gotten migraines as a child and know many people who suffer through them into adulthood, I can see someone at the time when there was less medical knowledge of that just grasping at any possible straw to see, why is this happening to me? And it's not like you could just pop an Excedrin migraine or go get that Botox treatment people are doing now. It's debilitating.
Yeah. Well, and interestingly, there was one period in her life where they stopped happening, and it was when she was shipped off to Cuba to rest by a doctor, where she apparently had a wonderful time. And then the migraines stayed away up through her marrying Hawthorne, and then returned right after the birth of her first child.
Fascinating.
It's also worth noting that all of the migraines she had were treated with more heavy narcotics.
Yeah.
So basically, with the exception of like those few years in Cuba and then her early marriage up until she had her first kid, she was always unwell. And whether it was psychological, psychosomatic, physical, some combination of all of those things, she was one of those people who was ill enough that she bounced from doctor to doctor and was subjected to different kinds of treatment by different kinds of medical professionals.
Yeah.
And I really think that it is not at all a stretch, at least in some way, to read Rappaccini's daughter as an allegory for not just the medical debates of the era, like of Hawthorne's era, but the way in which they always played out, or which they seemed to mostly play out, on the bodies of women.
Yeah.
Who had very little agency of their own.
Yeah, and I mean, with that history of his wife and everything, I see why that would be very present on his mind, and watching her bounce from doctor to doctor, and, presuming they did have, a loving marriage, that must be very hard to watch someone you love go through that.
Well, and I get the impression from what I've read that it was particularly bad when she was younger, before she married him.
Gotcha.
By the point of their marriage, they were 1840s hippies, kind of.
Okay. Tight. Love that.
Later in their marriage, they get into, homeopathy and...
Oh, Lord.
They're into, alternative medicine. You get the impression that they would have been, big into crystals and, Instagram wellness tips.
And, doTERRA reps.
Sure, I don't know what that is.
Oh, it's one of the essential oil MLMs.
Yeah, they would have been big into it. Well, I guess they were into essential oils if they were into homeopathy even back then. Yeah, they definitely turned into hippies, but especially when she was younger and before they got married, I get the impression that it was pretty bad. And she would have told him about it. Yeah. You know what I mean? And so I think in some ways this is Hawthorne kind of fumblingly trying his feminist best, or whatever passes for it at the time.
Good for you, buddy.
Oh, you're trying.
Well, didn't I know we talked about this briefly the other day, but didn't the Scarlet Letter have some elements of that? Am I misremembering? I feel like you and I talked about this recently.
Yeah, the Scarlet Letter.
So again, I haven't actually read it. I'm aware of
Yeah, I mean, you can't call him a feminist, you can't call this a feminist, but he certainly seems to have conceived of women as people in a way that was better than the average.
Yeah, he was a few steps ahead of a lot of his contemporaries.
And I mean, you know, in the story specifically, like, Rappaccini and Baglioni seem primarily concerned with their feud with each other.
Baglioni doesn't seem like he cares about Beatrice. He just is bitter about Rappaccini and doesn't like his methods. And I mean, clearly he didn't have stellar methods all of the time, but like, Beatrice was just a pawn in their dumb argument that they were having.
Yeah, I mean, like, Baglioni killed her to prove a point, which is... And the last words of the story being him mocking a man whose daughter just died in front of him.
His body's still warm laying in front of them, and he's like, haha, I gotcha.
Truly bonkers. But then, like, Rappaccini, on the other hand, you know, he's off page most of the story, and we know that he's really... I don't know. Rappaccini, to me, is a really interesting figure.
Very much so. I'd be curious to see him fleshed out a little bit more and see some of his motivations and things.
Yeah.
Outside of that one quote there.
Because, like, it's noted that he's a very effective doctor, which is important. And that he's, like, kind of spooky and standoffish.
Yeah.
He feels to me more sympathetic than Baglioni in a way. Although, like, I think primarily his interest in Beatrice is as a means of preserving his own legacy and propping up his own viewpoint.
Yeah.
Like, I think it's worth noting that Rappaccini doesn't have a son, right?
Right.
Rappaccini's daughter is Rappaccini's only child.
Yeah, this is his heir.
Exactly. And you've got the whole kind of religious element of this, you know, intentionally invoked parallel with the Garden of Eden. Mm-hmm. But Rappaccini isn't Adam. He's God. And Beatrice is Eve.
Yeah.
And they brought Giovanni in to be Adam in this kind of dark, spooky, parallel Garden of Eden.
Would that make Baglioni the snake?
Yes? That's interesting, too, because that makes Giovanni Eve.
Yeah.
That makes Beatrice Adam.
Yep.
Hawthorne said, trans rights.
My man. Yeah, that is a really interesting parallel.
And, like, all three of these men fall so short of living up to what Beatrice needs them to be. And Giovanni's just a tit. Like, one of the papers I read about this book essentially said that Giovanni's greatest sin is not being worthy of Beatrice in the end. And it's true. Like, he can't even love her in a way that's meaningful.
And he never really did love her.
No, and if you think about Rappaccini and Baglioni as kind of the warring doctors, and Giovanni as a stand-in for all of the useless husbands and brothers and fathers who are turfing their wives and daughters out to these doctors without really understanding what they're doing.
Yeah.
Without really caring how they feel about it, as long as it's effective and allows them to go be useful again, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, this is the 1840s. If a woman is sick, the biggest problem with her being sick is that she's not doing her mom and wife stuff.
Yeah, this isn't, oh, we're so deeply concerned about your well-being. It's you are not performing your role as a wife.
That's a shallow love, right? You know, that's a very shallow affection.
Mm-hmm. Just something else I was thinking about, and I don't know, partially because we like therapize each other all the time, and partially because I read like a ton of advice columns, but I just completely lost my train of thought.
It'll come back.
Okay. Thing that fascinated me about this was that she never asked her dad about why any of this was going on until it reached like full crisis mode with Giovanni. It's just interesting to me. Why did she never question that? Is it just because like the father is kind of the all-seeing eye of the family? This is like, why would you even question that? Is that like a cultural thing of the time? I just found that very interesting because I think I think we both know a lot of people and have done this ourselves where it's like, you don't question a thing that is ostensibly very weird until it all comes to a head. And then all of a sudden it's like, wait a second, why is it like this? Like, this shouldn't be this way.
Wait a minute. Other ladies aren't made of poison. Why am I made of poison?
Hold on a second.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And there is a line in there sort of midway through the romance between Beatrice and Giovanni. Or no, actually, there's a line in there right toward the end where Beatrice is talking about how lonely it is to be cut off from humanity. And she basically says that she didn't realize how lonely until Giovanni was there. Mm-hmm. That, like, through lack of love, through lack of contact with the outside world, she was just kind of drifting along.
This is just how she knows life to be, and then all of a sudden there's some glitch in her matrix that's like a whole new world.
A new fantastic way to die.
Also now that I'm saying that, also some parallels between her and Jasmine.
Drinking some antidote, it's down my throat, and now I'm gonna die in front of you. I think that's a really good point. And like, it's so hard to kind of tease Beatrice's story out of this story because it is, at the end of the day, narrated by Giovanni.
Yeah.
Who fucks up. Like, he's not a great dude. And it makes me wonder, like, Hawthorne pretty famously is a very didactic writer. Mm-hmm. Hawthorne likes to decide what his point is, and then he rolls it up like a newspaper and bats you on the nose with it, page after page after page after page, until the book is over. Like, that is what Hawthorne does. He is allergic to subtlety. Mm-hmm,
mm-hmm. Picked up on that a little bit from this story.
And so, like, I guess my question is, or one of the things that I think is interesting to think about is, because he is so allergic to subtlety, if the story is inspired by his wife and by his wife's story, why is Giovanni the narrator? Why is Giovanni the one we're following? A part of me wonders if this is aimed at the brothers and fathers and husbands. And it's worth noting that this story is more oblique than a lot of his other work because he didn't feel comfortable going like full-throatedly, the medical profession is more invested in debating with itself than taking care of its patient. Like he felt like he had to pull it back a little bit. So this is one of his more tiptoey stories. But, you know, like, Beatrice doesn't get a ton of characterization. Like, all we know about Beatrice is that she's just lovely.
She's, like, pretty and she's nice. And she's poison.
And highly toxic. Yeah. Like a flower.
I know. I was going to say that it feels like none of the characters are really fully fleshed out. And then I was like, right, it is a short story. He only had so many pages to get this information in there.
Yeah, not a ton to work with. But, I mean, you think about where medicine was at the time especially, and on the one hand, you had doctors who were just giving everyone all of the drugs, all of the, just like, all the narcotics you can eat.
Cocaine and everything.
And then you had another section of the medical profession who were barely past humors and leeches. Barely.
Yeah.
And there was still some debate. They were still kind of leaning on some of those weird old-timey ideas of like curing like, which is where you get like humors and homeopathy from.
Yeah.
And then you've got a whole subset of just outright grifters and quacks.
This is in the period of time in which you could still just be like, hey, I'm a doctor. And people were like, oh, cool, you're a doctor? What's up? And they're like, yeah. No, I just decided I'm going to be a doctor. Like, I know there were medical schools and there was, like, a school of thought around it and everything, but, like, it was, like, around the turn of the next century, like, early 1900s, where that became much harder to do.
Yeah, I mean, 1840s, we haven't even hit the Civil War yet, which is when the medical profession sort of jumped forward a lot by virtue of all the people dying all willy-nilly.
Yeah.
Which tends to happen. Mm-hmm. It's not particularly sophisticated. And so, yeah, you know, I mean, I think that's definitely like a big subtext here.
They certainly didn't have medical ethical boards at this point in time.
Absolutely not. They were just going around poisoning each other's kids. Yep. That's how you solved a problem back then.
I mean, if it works, it works. I hope Rappaccini learned his lesson.
Get it together. Well, and speaking of Rappaccini, the other thing, sort of stepping away from the historical context bit, is Rappaccini's kind of like a proto mad scientist character.
Oh, 100%. Also, like, this brought to mind so many like random pop culture moments, but like Little Shop of Horrors is one that immediately came into my brain because duh. But yeah, he definitely had just strong mad scientist vibes.
And Beatrice as like the sympathetic and doomed experiment. Mm-hmm. I feel like you can definitely see the influence of Frankenstein in this.
Oh, absolutely.
Definitely, you know, I mean, it's a gothic. It is a fully gothic short story.
Yeah. Would Frankenstein be considered gothic?
Frankenstein is gothic-ish.
Right.
And there's a case to be made for Rappaccini's daughter as like proto science fiction. I mean, there's all this stuff in there, some of which I skimmed over just so that we had time to like actually get through the whole thing.
Yeah.
Without this being 8 million hours long. But you know, you've got this whole thing where he's violating the laws of nature. Like, he has bred all of these plants that shouldn't have existed, and they're deeply, deeply poisonous, but they also have the potential to be incredibly life-saving, right? That's the thing that's established.
Yeah.
That is such a standard of science fiction. You know what I mean?
Oh, truly, truly. And kind of unrelated to that, but I was just like, I wonder what plants he's growing. Like, what was he hybridizing? Do they mention any of the species that he's working with? Because I am curious.
A true gardener. It's like, he's gone mad with power and killed his own child. And you're like, what was he growing?
I really want to know.
Rappaccini's gardener. Rappaccini's nosy neighbor. Lovely petunias you have there. Are they toxic? Yeah. So, I mean, I think it's very allegorical. It's very fairy tale-esque. There's not like a ton going. I mean, I've read entire PhD theses about it at this point, but like that kind of hits some of the big. Do you have any other questions?
I can't think of any other questions right now. So my brain was running through a lot of just like random pop culture references and, like I said, plant questions, which are not going to be answered by that story or this podcast, but can't really think of anything else right now.
What's your favorite poisonous plant?
Ooh, I mean, we both love the hellebores. So many of them in our garden.
Hard to go wrong with a hellebore.
In the section of the garden that the dogs cannot get into.
Very important. You got to separate the poison garden. It's got to be its own little corner.
I really like the fact that, like, this isn't a specific plant or like type of poison plant, but I have always been fascinated by the way plants can be highly toxic to certain species and not to others. Like, for instance, I am a big fan of spicy, hot foods. Like, I love hot peppers. I love hot sauce. Like, give me all of it. I want to sweat while I'm eating. And the fact that that was developed by the plants is like a stay away, and humans are like, oh my God, give me more. Like, I like that kind of stuff a lot, where it's like, in some contexts, it's highly, highly poisonous and is like repelling creatures. And then in other contexts, it's like delicious food.
The only animals on Earth capable of masochism. Bless our cotton socks.
Yep. This is gonna suck, but it's gonna feel so good.
For my part, I think it's darkly hilarious that daffodils are viciously poisonous, and apparently if you accidentally eat like daffodil, it feels like you're swallowing like little handfuls of needles.
Oh no.
Yeah, it's real bad.
But they're so cute.
Yeah, don't eat them. Don't put them in your mouth. But yeah, so I mean, where else do you think we see this story kind of echoing forward? Like, did this make you think of anything that you've watched, read, listened to recently?
Well, I'm currently reading Carmilla, and I'm not through it yet, but speaking of taking away women's agency and like placing this giant burden on them that can actually also kill other people, like Carmilla is a classic kind of queer vibes lesbian vampire story, and so like that came into my head while I was doing it.
Yeah, speaking of toxic women.
Yeah. Again, I haven't finished that one yet, so I'm sure like upon completion of that story I will have a lot more parallels to draw there, but
you have to come back and tell me about it.
Yeah. And so like the vampirism is on my mind, and that is a very strong parallel there.
Yeah, definitely.
And also something that appeared a lot in like gothic themes.
When did Carmilla come out?
I know 1800s. I just read the whole introduction by
1872.
Okay, so yeah, Carmilla came out in 1872, so roughly 30-ish years later.
Yeah.
But still kind of in that same genre.
Same vein.
Yeah.
Poisonous women. We love them.
We do.
And I mean, obviously, you know, they reference the Greek myth in the story.
Right.
Of the poisonous woman. Like, this goes way back.
And that is a real myth. Like, I think I've heard that one before.
It is, and it's not the only one. I did some very cursory reading, but it apparently shows up in Greek mythology. It shows up in like old Hindu mythology. It's a story we like to tell because we are apparently low-key obsessed with what if Pretty Lady also poison? Because the patriarchy fears what it can't control.
Well, and both literally and like metaphorically poison, like who was what I should know this off the top of my head, but the Greek woman that was like the bearer of bad news, starts with the C, Cassandra. It was just on the tip of my tongue, and God, I love the internet for me being able to type in Greek myth, woman bearing bad news. Who's she? Yeah, so it's both, there's a lot of so many stories of both the literal and the metaphorical poison woman coming in. Like Cassandra was coming in telling them all of these stories and prophecies and everything, and they're like, you're crazy. You know, it's millennia we've been telling this story.
Yeah.
And even today, I mean, with women, like, not being the actual physical poison, but, like, we're looking at things like the Trump trial that just went on. And, like, women coming forward with these stories and everyone, like, turning them into these pariahs for saying these things. Like, does it ever stop?
Yeah, and we seem to be really particularly kind of obsessed with the idea of, like, turning women into weapons to wield against other men.
Yes.
Like, that is a story that we tell a lot. And it's interesting because, you know, one of the things that it kind of says is, like, a woman can only be scary if she's being wielded by another man. Like, women are only frightening insofar as they are tools of other dudes.
Tools by men against men.
Yeah, which is good.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm feeling really good about Western society. I think it's all going really well.
Feeling great, feeling good,
yeah.
Loving it.
I am excited to wake up tomorrow in a feminist, trans rights, gay rights paradise.
I am literally about to go home and make my man a sandwich, so.
You're fired. Your man's a very nice man. He deserves a good sandwich. But that's because he's a nice boy. Nice boys get sandwiches.
They do, and he's made me plenty of sandwiches before, so it goes both ways.
Bad boys get poisoned. Well, Galen, anything else?
I feel like we've covered some good bases.
Yeah, that was Rappaccini's daughter. Any final thoughts?
I want to grow more poison things.
Good call.
That's pretty much it. We need more poison plants to add to our current poison bed.
We'll go have a talk in the garden after this.
Sounds great.
I hope you're buying at the nursery, though.
Yeah, we can make that happen.
Yeah, good. Sounds good. I'm a broke ass. Well, thank you so much for being here. Last question. Any books that you would like to recommend to our listeners? Maybe inspired by what we talked about today, or just something you read recently and loved?
I haven't been, as you know, as deeply into the reading game lately due to many different factors. I am reading Carmilla and loving it right now, and it was edited. The edition I'm reading was edited by Carmen Maria Machado, who we both love.
Uh-huh.
And I feel like her body and other stories ties in really well to this. And regardless, I think everyone should read it. It's a fantastic collection of short stories, and I love it so much. I'm going to go with that. Read all of the queer vampire horror stories. There's
so many of them.
So many good things out there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you again for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I love you. And to everyone out there, thank you so much for listening. I love you too.
And not as much as she loves me.
That is true. You are my other spouse. We'll see you again soon. And if you can, this week, this month, this pay period, consider supporting a living author, because they could really use the love. Bye.
Bye.
Didn't Read It was created, written, and edited by me, Grace Todd. Kaylee Hughes is our publicist and producer. You can follow the podcast on Twitter or Instagram at Didn't Read It Pod, or reach us via email at didn'treaditpod@gmail.com. For source notes and further reading, as well as a list of all existing episodes, please visit our website at didn'treaditpod.com. We are recorded in Richmond, Virginia, with special thanks to Black Iris Social Club and Pesca Trio Publishing. If you enjoyed today's episode, please consider leaving us a review or rating on your preferred podcasting platform, or just tell a friend. If you did not enjoy today's episode, we are currently accepting applications for a full-time nemesis. Our intro music is Books, written, performed, and recorded by William Albritton. Our closing music for this episode is The Flower Duet from the opera Lakme, another story featuring poisonous flowers and a young woman doomed by the stupidity of the men around her. I'm beginning to sense a theme here. Recording courtesy of museopen.org.